What if I told you that just 3 centuries ago, the Indian subcontinent was one of the world's economic giants, so prosperous that it accounted for roughly a quarter of global output? Its textiles clothed emperors from Rome to Java, its mathematicians invented zero and the decimal system, and its shipbuilders launched sturdy vessels that even European navies admired. Now imagine that by the time India gained independence in 1947, its share of the world economy had collapsed to a tiny fraction. How did a civilization of such wealth, innovation, and cultural brilliance become so impoverished? This is the story of India's unmaking under British rule and of its remarkable resilience. For thousands of years, India was not a peripheral backwater, but a global hub. Farmers transformed the fertile plains of the Ganges, Indus, and Brahmaputra into breadbaskets producing rice, wheat, cotton, and spices. This agricultural surplus freed artisans and scholars to specialize. Indian weavers created cottons, muslins, and silks famed for their softness, bright dyes, and intricate patterns. Indian metalworkers produced high-quality Wootz steel, a pioneering alloy developed in southern India in the mid-1st millennium BC and exported across Asia and Europe. Shipyards in Bengal innovated with flush deck designs that made hulls stronger and more watertight. These designs were later copied by the British East India Company to improve their own vessels. India's merchants were masters of both land and sea. They used the Silk Road to exchange goods with Central Asia and the Middle East, and sailed across the Indian Ocean to East Africa, Southeast Asia, and China. Financial innovations such as bills of exchange and early forms of insurance facilitated long-distance trade. Meanwhile, India's universities and temples nurtured philosophical and scientific inquiry. Concepts like zero, positional notation, and trigonometry were formalized. Astronomers calculated planetary motions with impressive precision. Physicians compiled the Ayurvedic canon. These intellectual advances were intertwined with economic prosperity, creating a civilization that was both materially and culturally rich. When the British East India Company arrived in the early 17th century, it encountered a sophisticated society and an immensely profitable economy. But unlike earlier traders who assimilated into the local milieu, the company had a different agenda: extraction. It sought to transform India into a source of raw materials for British factories and a captive market for British goods. To achieve this, it used both force and policy. Indian producers faced heavy taxes and bans that strangled their ability to compete. By the 19th century, the British were imposing tariffs of 70 to 80% on textiles produced in India, while importing Indian raw cotton duty-free into Britain. British factories then sold finished cloth back to India, undercutting local weavers and destroying the export markets that had once made Indian textiles world famous. Protectionist policies in Britain, coupled with high land revenue demands in India, shattered the delicate balance that had supported artisans and farmers. This assault went far beyond textiles. Modern industrial technology was deliberately kept out of Indian hands. Iron foundries and mechanized mills were discouraged from opening, leaving Indian entrepreneurs at a standstill while the Industrial Revolution roared ahead in Britain. Even infrastructure projects served imperial interests. Railways, often touted as a colonial gift, were designed primarily to funnel cotton, timber, and opium from the interior to the ports and to speed up troop movements. Financing arrangements guaranteed British investors a profit while saddling Indian taxpayers with the costs. Tracks and locomotives were imported from Britain, providing little stimulus to local industry. In short, infrastructure was built to facilitate extraction, not to develop India. Economic policies had a devastating human toll. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, drought struck, but the East India Company continued to collect taxes. Estimates of the death toll range from 1 to 10 million. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, India suffered a series of famines. Drought was a factor, but so were policy failures, high taxes, forced exports of grain, and an indifference to relief. Famines like those of 1876, 78, and 1943 were so severe that they left lasting scars on population growth. British government inaction often worsened these disasters. At the same time, the British reshaped Indian society through new revenue systems, the permanent settlement, Rayatwari and Mahalwari, that dispossessed many traditional landholders and created a class of landlords loyal to the colonial state. Farmers who once had security of tenure became tenants or landless laborers. Western education was introduced not to uplift the masses, but to train clerks to serve the colonial administration, and colonial officials refined a policy of divide and rule, exploiting caste, religious and regional differences to prevent unified resistance. These strategies sowed seeds of communal tension that later erupted during the partition of 1947. The cumulative effect of these policies was a massive transfer of wealth from India to Britain. Economist Dadabhai Naoroji called it the drain of wealth, and modern scholars estimate it at tens of trillions of dollars in today's terms. Taxes collected in India paid for the salaries and pensions of British officials, the maintenance of the British Army, and wars fought far from Indian shores. A mechanism called home charges forced India to pay for expenses incurred in London on its behalf. Meanwhile, India's share of world GDP plummeted. In 1820, India still produced about 16% of global output, but by 1870, its share had fallen to 12%, and by 1947 to just a few percent. According to British economist Angus Maddison's estimates, India's share of world income declined from roughly 27% in 1700 to about 3% by 1950. Britain's wealth grew in direct proportion to India's impoverishment. When India finally gained independence in 1947, it faced monumental challenges. The economy was devastated, communal tensions flared, and tens of millions of people were displaced during partition. Yet the newly independent nation set about rebuilding. Under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India launched ambitious 5-year plans to industrialize and modernize agriculture. It invested in dams, steel plants, and science institutions, established universities, and enacted land reforms. One of the clearest indicators of progress was the disappearance of large-scale famines. Food security policies, improved irrigation, and disaster relief meant that the horrors of colonial famines were not repeated. Though poverty and inequality persisted, India gradually regained economic traction. In the decades since, India has transformed into the world's largest democracy and one of the fastest-growing major economies. It now exports software, pharmaceuticals, and satellites alongside cotton and tea. Its scientists and engineers work at the frontiers of technology, and its cultural influence stretches from Bollywood to Silicon Valley. The story of India's unmaking is thus also a story of resilience and recovery. It shows how a civilization reduced to poverty by imperial exploitation can rebuild and reclaim its place on the world stage. The rise and fall of India under British rule is one of history's most dramatic arcs. It reminds us that colonialism wasn't an abstract policy, but a lived experience of exploitation, famine, and resistance. It also highlights how enduring cultural, intellectual, and economic strengths can survive even centuries of plunder. As we reflect on this history, we honor the millions who suffered and the generations who fought to rebuild, and we recognize that understanding the past is essential if we are to build a future rooted in justice and self-determination.